We are talking with aviation expert Ken Jenkins, a leader in the field of aviation emergency management. And let's start with the Delta jetliners sliding off the runway at LaGuardia Airport today. Thank you for being with us, Ken.
Hey, good evening, Jim.
You have to wonder, I suppose, given conditions, I know certainly in Washington, and I have to assume further north they're as bad or worse in New York City, why flights were landing at LaGuardia at all.
Well, the weather certainly was a factor today, wasn't it, all up and down the East Coast. From what I've been able to gather from the news reports and weather displays, LaGuardia Airport had actually just snowplowed the runways, and flights before Delta 1086 had landed reported good braking action and things were going well, but snow was still falling, so apparently in just a few minutes' time it went from good to bad.
In other words, in a case like that, I guess there's not much you can do. Airports and airliners cannot stop on a dime, and so even if you were to, let's say, divert planes to another airport, some planes are probably too close, maybe too low on fuel. I'm just speculating here, but in other words, it's difficult. Once you make the decision that an airport is to be closed, to keep every plane from landing at that juncture, isn't it?
And that's very true. And we don't know in this particular case with Delta 1086 how much fuel there was. In weather conditions, oftentimes the commercial jets will fly with additional fuel for that purpose of diversion, as you mentioned. But for all intent and purposes, from what we can see right now, the airport was open. The runway was open. Things were cleared. Planes had landed just fine. And for whatever reason, this one didn't. And weather certainly most likely is a factor, but as mentioned, the NTSB's on the ground there, and they'll investigate and see what else may have contributed to this accident.
And then we have, of course, the case of Harrison Ford, one of the more well-known pilots around the country. And for those who are not aware of this, Ford was flying a rather old, I guess, plane. The engine, apparently, from what we've been able to learn from eyewitnesses, went out. He crash-landed the plane onto a golf course near Los Angeles and is described by his son as banged up, but okay, basically. So that's the good news there. I can recall a few years ago when John Denver was flying an experimental craft which crashed into the ocean, I believe in the Pacific Ocean just off the coast of California. Looking at private plane, the safety record for private planes in general in this country, is it as good as the airlines?
The general aviation accident rate is higher than commercial aviation, but if you look at it overall as an aggregate, it is still really very, very low. But you also have to look at the fact that there are many, many more general aviation flights. So to keep it in perspective, I would say general aviation is just as safe as commercial aviation. Mm-hmm.
The standards for flying a plane in this country, are they up to where you think they ought to be? In other words, that most of the people who get a private pilot's license who are authorized to solo are in fact equipped as much as training can make them to do so?
Well, I think so for general aviation, and certainly they have been tightened up for commercial aviation in 2014 for commercial aviators, for pilots wanting to become a first officer. The number of hours that they needed to have, Jim, substantially increased. It had been 250 hours, and the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, increased the number to 1,500 hours, which is interesting in that there are many people that are saying that that's going to contribute or is contributing to this pilot shortage that we're experiencing.
And we're going to come back and certainly talk about that pilot shortage here in just a moment. One other thing I wanted to bring up about general aviation, to what extent do we still see small planes landing at big airports? In other words, Piper Cubs taxiing next to 747s, that kind of thing.
Well, you do see it. I mean, it certainly does take place. It's not as frequent, I think, as it used to be in the past. As general aviation has grown somewhat, their airports have also grown, and they're better accommodated to with really good runways and whatnot, that they don't all have to share the same airport space, the larger airports, as you just mentioned.
We'll come back and we're going to talk some more with our guest, Ken Jenkins. He is the author of the forthcoming book, Resilience, Stories of Courage and Survival in Aviation Disasters, published through Seeger Enterprises, S-E-G-R Enterprises. How do you pronounce that, by the way?
It's S-E-G-R.
You say the initials. You don't try to make it into a word.
That's correct, sir.
Gotcha.
Yes.
I got it. Anyway, more about that. And again, this pilot shortage, which some may not quite understand. I must confess I didn't, but we'll all learn together when we come back in just a moment. We're talking with aviation expert Ken Jenkins. He's a leader in the field of aviation emergency management, author of the forthcoming book, Resilience, Stories of Courage and Survival in Aviation Disasters, published through SEGR Enterprises. Now, a pilot shortage. What's causing this pilot shortage?
Hey, Jim, well, that's a very interesting question, and actually it stems back to, if you go back to about 1999 and the year 2000 or so, when the major carriers like Delta and American and Continental were beginning to lose money, and the airline industry wasn't doing very well. They were laying off employees. And then in 2001, of course, we had the unfortunate terrorist events of 9/11, and the airline industry took yet another hit in terms of financial losses, and a lot of pilots and flight attendants and good working airline employees were laid off. And for 10 years, well, anywhere from 6 to 10 years after that, a number of airlines weren't hiring pilots because there wasn't a need for them. And those pilots were either assimilated back into other positions within the United States, or they went to work as pilots in airlines around the world. We've also seen a decline in military pilots leaving for aviation jobs, and there are a large number of retirements. There are differing numbers in the forecast for the retirements, but it looks like over the next 6 years there's an expectation of 35,000 to 40,000 retirements in the pipeline. But one of the largest things that's been kind of kicked around here in terms of discussion is that new FAA requirement of the 1,500 hours that a first officer has to have, well, to become a first officer and receive his or her airline transport pilot certificate. And that changed in 2014.
And at the same time that you've got to have more hours to qualify, we've now got this FAA mandated age 65 retirement level, which like any age related level is obviously to a certain extent arbitrary. I mean, letting somebody drive at the age of 16. I mean, I'm sure there are some people physically and mentally who could drive at 12, and others aren't qualified to drive at 46. So you have to draw a line somewhere. And that's where that is. The 65 in this day and age of modern nutrition and exercise equipment and the like. Do you think that that's necessary?
Well, I think there needs to be an age limit. I don't know that 65 is it. You certainly bring up some good points as to why it could even potentially be extended, and it has been extended once from the age 60 to 65, and part of that were for that extension were for the reasons you mentioned, and also to help kind of stave off this looming pilot shortage. And pilots have to undergo rigorous medical exams and whatnot to maintain their certification to be able to fly. So is it unreasonable that the FAA may change that age? I don't think so. I just don't know what that number would be. Now,
there's something else, too, that many people may not be aware of, but just as the NCAA is the unofficial but actual farm system for the NBA and the NFL, and players play in college, they don't even go to get a degree in many cases. They're there just to play long enough to show the pros what they've got. Likewise, the military has served as the farm system for commercial airliners. You've got a lot of pilots. Let's say you get your degree, maybe an ROTC commission or a Service Academy commission. You're 22. You put in 20 years in the military. You're 42. You can take retirement, but you're hardly over the hill. And that's where an awful lot of commercial airline pilots came from. And the military, of course, has cut back. Is that contributing to this?
Yes, sir, it is. And actually what you're seeing is because the aviation industry as a whole hasn't been hiring a lot of pilots, until recently, since they've had some financial success over the last year or so, a lot of the pilots, military pilots, have stayed in the military or have left the military for other aviation jobs outside of flying. And so we've seen that number decrease. One of the other reasons I think we're seeing this shortage outside of the hours that we talked about, that 250-hour minimum has now changed to 1,500, is the sheer expense of it all. It's not like going to a university and getting your 4-year degree and then you're ready to become a pilot. Those 1,500 hours translate into actual costs for the would-be pilot to get that flight time. And to go to an aviation academy and achieve the designation that they need and the skills that they need can, on the low end, range anywhere from $50,000 upwards of $100,000 plus. And that doesn't even include a 2-year associate degree, which is an additional fee on top of it. So there's a huge expense. I mean, outside of the passion for flying, there's a lot of money involved in obtaining your ATP.
Mm-hmm. To a call from John in Dothan, Alabama on the Jim Bohannon Show for our guest, aviation expert Ken Jenkins. Good evening, John.
Hey, Jimbo. Hey, Mr. Jenkins, I had a quick question for you. A little while ago, you was discussing the icy runways at LaGuardia and other airports around the country, and I just wanted to know if you could share your thoughts on why the commercial industry has not invested in vertical takeoff and landing technology like the British have in the Harrier jet, why that technology is not being used in maybe the commercial field to help deal with situations that were, you know, you'd have an icy runway. If you have vertical takeoff and landing, you could literally stop and land.
Well, I'll tell you that I just would have to guess, Ken, that it takes a lot of fuel and a very expensive airplane to do that vertical takeoff and landing thing, not to mention the fact that not every pilot can do that.
Well, that's true, and and it's a very interesting question, and certainly, when you look at it, it's not a bad concept, but then you're also looking at not only the additional hours for flying to learn that type of aircraft, but the cost of the aircraft itself, and then you would have to retrofit and adapt the airports to be able to handle those kinds of flights. And I mean, at the end of the day, Jim, it just simply comes down to the cost feasibility. And at this point, I don't think the cost is there. It's not low enough to explore that potential aspect of a vertical landing or vertical takeoff.
Yeah, but good point, John, and who knows what the future may hold. Now then, there are, of course, all of these regional carriers that have pilots, and the wage disparity, I was amazed. But if you could give folks an idea of what, say, one of the big airliners, the Deltas, Uniteds, what have you, what their pilots typically earn compared with what some of those little puddle jumper airlines pilots typically earn.
Well, the range is it's certainly significant between the regional airlines and commercial. And when we say commercial, regional airline pilots are commercial pilots as well. We're looking at the larger airlines like an American, Delta, and United. A regional airline pilot, a new pilot, is going to start, Jim, somewhere around the $20 an hour range, and depending on the number of hours they fly, most likely is going to make somewhere around $20,000, maybe a little bit more or less, depending on the hours flown.
$20,000. In other words, it is quite possible for somebody who is a pilot for an airline, a regional airline, depending on how many family members, how many dependents he has, who might not only be a pilot, but he might qualify for food stamps.
That's correct. Yes, sir.
I have a problem with that kind of a pay differential. Whereas the big boys, most of them, aren't they making close to $100,000?
It certainly can be, and that depends on their seniority and the route and the type of aircraft they're flying. But they certainly can get into the 6-digit numbers. Yeah. And the longer they've been with the airline and the higher the instrument rating and the type of aircraft they're flying and the international routes and whatnot certainly contribute to their salary. And that's where you see, I think, when you look at the larger carriers, the pilot shortage isn't so much in those ranks as those folks retire, then the senior regional jet pilots move into those vacated slots from the commercial carriers. The problem is that we're not getting a lot of people going into the regional airlines to fly simply because of that expense we talked about earlier before the break. If it's costing $50,000 to $100,000 plus to get the hours you need and the education you need, and you start a job at $20,000 a year, it's going to take years to pay off that debt. And so we're just not seeing the huge increase in demand in the regional jet market in terms of people moving into that field.
Well, now, if the airlines are the ones who are desperate for these people, and there you got people who can fly jets, for Pete's sake, I can't think that all that education is needed if you're maybe it's needed if you're going from nothing to flying a big jet. But if you've already flown a regional airline, surely most of that extra education is not necessary. Plus, why wouldn't the airlines, desperate for pilots, simply say, hey, we'll cover the cost of the expenditures as we bring you aboard? I mean, the training as we bring you aboard.
Well, it's that nasty four-letter word that you just mentioned, too, and that is cost.